inside the admissions office, your one-stop shop for expert advice on the smart way to get in. My name is Ellen, and each episode I'll bring you an interview with a former admissions officer, a graduate of a top college, or an admissions expert. These interviews will take you inside the admissions office and will be full of behind-the-scenes knowledge, first-hand experiences, and application tips to help you get into your dream school. If you'd like to chat with one of these experts, you can sign up for a free consultation at the link in the description of this episode. Today, we'll hear from Columba MFA graduate, InGenius Prep Graduate Coach, and writing professor at the University of New Haven, Padya Paramita. Padya and I will discuss some major changes in the world of college admissions for the 2022 to 23 application cycle, including changes in test optional policies and quotas at top schools like the UCs. Could you just give me a quick summary of your background, and maybe for new listeners, or if you had any changes since you were last on?
Yeah, absolutely. So I went to Wellesley College for my undergrad. I graduated with a double major in English and creative writing and women's and gender studies. And after graduation, I joined InGenius Prep as the digital content specialist, where I wrote over 400 blogs on the admissions process. I'm also a graduate coach here, which means that I help our students apply to their top choice colleges and help them with essays and things like that. A couple of years ago, I started at Columbia for my MFA in creative nonfiction, and I finished this past May. And I have recently started, as you mentioned, as a writing professor at the University of New Haven. So really just all about the college scene has taken over my last few years. Yeah.
The first major change that we'll be discussing is that many popular schools in Texas, originally you would apply through them through the Apply Texas application online, but many of these schools have now joined the Common App. So you just want to tell us more about that, what has motivated this change, and then is there a benefit to still using Apply Texas versus using the Common App to apply to these schools?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say the motivation behind this change is that the Common App is more centralized. It has 1,000 colleges. A lot of people don't want to open, multiple accounts on multiple websites. So the Texas colleges probably thought it would be easier for their, potential applicants to come in through an application system that they were already using. They wanted to attract a wider number of students, giving them a chance to use their Common App personal statement for their Texas application. In terms of benefits, I would say there are still some advantages to using the Apply Texas over the Common App. If they're only applying to multiple colleges in Texas, that's still fine to use Apply Texas, and they'll only have to write one of the 3 Apply Texas prompts, which actually have a word limit suggestion of 1,200 to 1,500 rather than 650. So you can write a longer essay, and you're able to submit only 10 extracurriculars for the Common App. But in Apply Texas, you split the extracurriculars that you have into community service, allowing up to, describing 8 community service activities. It also has 8 slots to enter honors, awards, talents, which is more than the Common App honors section offers as well.
Do you think we might see a similar change in the future with the UCs of them migrating to the Common App?
Oh, the UCs are so independent. I actually don't. I think MIT and UCs will always continue to use their own application. I think Georgetown might be a surprise, because Georgetown has very slowly been integrating more newer technologies, as in they stopped sending their acceptance letters by mail very recently. So they're making a very slow process of coming into technology. So maybe they'll join the Common App someday, but I don't see the UCs in particular, especially with how they're becoming test blind and making all of these decisions on their own, and how they have this very specific essay requirement, that they would join the Common App very soon in the future.
Speaking of California, my alma mater, USC, they've recently added an early action option.
Yeah.
What would you say is the motivation for this? What kind of students do you think are the best fit for this early action option at USC?
Yeah, I'm sure, as you know, a lot of students are excited about USC. It offers so many different types of majors and schools, especially students who are interested in journalism and theater and dance like you, Ellen. So in order to accommodate for all of these students who are so enthusiastic, I'm sure that's why they introduced this new policy. So I would say the best fit for this new option would be students who are excited about USC, and they can have their application ready by November 1st. And applying early shows that you are committed to the school, you're excited to the school, and if it's your number one choice, this can give you an advantage.
Now, the policies for like which school students can apply to ED, EA at the same time can get really complicated and confusing, and we have a lot of questions about this.
Yeah.
So if a student's applying EA to USC, can they apply EA elsewhere, and could they apply ED elsewhere?
Right. Yeah, this was something that I was confused about. Our readers were confused about. We had to do a lot of research to get to the bottom of this, but the consensus is that you can apply early decision to any other school. So you can apply binding to Brown or Columbia, for example, and you can still apply regular early action to any large public institution. However, you can't apply restrictive early action or single choice early action to a private school like Harvard or Yale. These do not allow you to EA to private institutions in return. So again, you can ED, you can EA Michigan, for example, and still EA USC, but you cannot REA Harvard, Yale, or Stanford and still EA USC.
If students have questions, if they're still confused, can they ask the admissions office about this? Or is this kind of like a low-key thing where people are like using a loophole to do these extra applications early?
No, absolutely. I think they can ask either the admissions officers at USC, who I'm sure are getting a lot of questions about this, or they can clarify with a school like Yale and figure out what they are allowed and not allowed to do. I would say the USC admissions offices have always been very helpful. I've reached out to them before about other questions and they've very promptly replied to me. So I think you can go ahead and do that. And because it is the first year, I'm sure they know that people will have questions.
It's all the sunshine in LA. It makes people very nice.
Yeah.
It's like a theory. People in Southern California are very nice.
Oh.
Another change is that top schools, including NYU, Columbia, UPenn, they've made changes to their supplemental essays. For NYU, I think they got rid of their like classic Why NYU essay and replaced it with one about identity that's optional. So what motivated these changes for schools like NYU where the new supplemental essay is optional? Do you think that they should respond?
Yeah, any question that's optional and you are able to answer it, I think you should. I think the one case in which you shouldn't answer an optional question would be if something asked, maybe if you're part of the LGBTQ community and do you wish to elaborate on that? Maybe don't answer that kind of optional question. But for something such as NYU, which is such a competitive school, and you will be using any chance you get to differentiate yourself from others, absolutely write the supplemental question, which is focused on identity, on diversity, how you can contribute to a community, what is an interest of yours. So something I would say is that I would say that NYU probably wanted to spice things up a little because yes, it was such a tradition and they have broken that, but I think perhaps they are now aware of how in demand they are. Everybody wants NYU. You know, rankings don't really matter. People love NYU. So just like any other school, they're trying to see fit. So by answering that question, you can help them see how you'll belong there. And then with Columbia, they now have a 35-word essay about what brings you joy, and Penn wants you to write a short thank you note to someone you haven't thanked yet. So these kind of questions want to see students express more positivity, I would say. I think especially given that high school seniors now spent so much time of the past couple of years in a pandemic, at home, surrounded, you know, without their friends. So this is a chance to really express gratitude or focus on things that bring you joy so that students can, you know, show themselves in a more positive light.
And just to clarify your example, do you mean with like the LGBTQ question, do you mean if the student isn't part of that community, they shouldn't respond?
Right. That is not like an ally prompt at all. So they're usually like, if you're part of the LGBTQ community, you can expand on your identity as such. So those optional questions are truly optional, but something like NYU supplemental essay is not optional, really. Right.
And we're going to discuss this more later, but right now the Supreme Court, and I think as of October, so about when this episode is coming out, is going to hear first arguments for a court case concerning affirmative action and race-conscious admissions at Harvard and UNC Chapel Hill. And there is speculation that that case might go against them. So I know like a big question right now in college admissions is like the future of race in college admissions. And, you know, these universities still have a commitment to bringing in diverse classes, but they might need like new strategies to do that. Do you think in the future we might see more changes like this NYU supplemental essay where they're using other aspects of the application to help them understand how they can bring in a more diverse class?
Absolutely. So, a decision like that might eliminate questions about race specifically from the profile side of the Common App. So instead, essays might be more focused towards diversity. For example, in law school applications, we see an optional diversity statement where students can elaborate on that. And, if they don't feel like they are a minority in a racial or ethnic background way, they can always talk about a hobby that's unique that makes them different. So it doesn't necessarily have to be that you have to answer a diversity question with your demographic background. There are a lot of ways to kind of answer these questions.
Right. And moving back to the West Coast, the UC's University of California Consortium.
Yeah.
That one's a little too hard for me. They didn't teach us that at USC. The UCs are reducing spots, which isn't a huge surprise to anyone. There's been recent news articles as of like September 2022 about like serious housing. There's always articles about serious housing crises, but it's been especially bad recently in places like UC Berkeley. So can you talk about like what in addition to that has motivated changes for the UCs to reduce spots? And then how is this going to affect out-of-state and international students?
Yeah, so like you said, the housing situation, I would imagine the fires are contributing to a crisis in resources as well. I would also say that from an admissions perspective, probably they want to make more space for California residents. So one of the purposes for any large public school, such as the University of California, is to prioritize the in-state candidates, and therefore they often get tuition and auto admission advantages at a lot of these schools. But the UCs have become, extremely in demand from outside California in the last decade, because obviously they are very good schools. They offer a lot of really interesting majors. UC Berkeley and UCLA are very famous, whether for sports, for their academic offerings. And I know a lot of my international students, for example, are very fascinated by the UCs and find themselves looking at them. So I would think that they just kind of decided to adjust accordingly, because their priority has been in a fundamental basis to take consideration of California residents first. And in terms of how this might affect out-of-state and international students, I think both categories of students who do not live in California right now and don't count as California residents will have a significantly lower chance of being admitted to the UCs, especially the very competitive one. Despite reduced spots, though, I think UC's test blind policy will mean that the number of applications will continue to rise. And we actually saw last year that the UCs were very competitive.
Right. So do you think students should consider maybe applying to some private California colleges? Because if you're applying out of state to a UC or an international student anyway, you're not qualifying for in-state tuition. So maybe students diversifying their school list.
Yeah, I mean, depends on the circumstance. California does have a lot of great schools. There's like Pomona, there's the Claremont colleges, there is USC. So a lot of different options if California is the reason that you're applying to the UCs. I would also say that a lot of students have in the past used non-UC Berkeley and UCLA UC schools as safeties, but that's not necessarily the case anymore. There's just no such things as targets and safeties. For example, students who are not admitted actually to UC Santa Barbara, San Diego, Irvine, and Davis last year might have gotten in the past, and vice versa. Like students that we've seen get into these in the years past may not have gotten in last year because they were just so competitive because of how in demand the UCs are. And they really do seem focused on yield, and they seem to have some early movements happening in the wait list. Like last March, very soon after the decisions came out, UC Irvine saw movements in their wait list already. So they are paying a lot of attention to who is likely to attend when they get in. So I would say that if you are strategizing in terms of which UCs to apply to, only apply to UCs that you know that you will attend if you get it. So make sure you are considerate of that, because I think they can tell when someone is trying to use them as a safety.
It'll be interesting to see how the UCs respond to this demand over time. I just saw an article about UCLA purchased a bunch of land in Rancho Palos Verdes, which is quite far from the UCLA campus in Westwood, especially like in LA traffic. And traffic could easily take like an hour to get there. So it'll be interesting to see like what their vision is for like satellite campuses to respond to demand, but then also, how will that affect the student experience?
Totally. Yeah.
So another change is that most schools, this isn't a change, this is kind of like a continuation that a lot of schools are continuing, as you said, these test optional policies. Do you have any idea how long these policies we can expect them to stay? A lot of schools have said like, oh, like we're through 2026 or 2027.
Yeah.
Do you think that date will just keep being pushed back?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the list, so many schools have already talked about going permanently test optional or test blind, such as the Cal State School, Cornell's Agriculture School, Reed, the UC's, University of San Diego, University of Washington. They've just dropped this for the foreseeable future. And then, we have schools like Harvard and Johns Hopkins and Northeastern who have said that they are going to be test optional until 2026, which is a long time. So I think other schools will follow the lead, and they are very influential schools. If Harvard's doing something, maybe people will pay more attention to it and think like, oh, this might be something worth exploring. And so if students continue to opt for this route and they see that there is success and they are able to accept and support a lot more deserving students because they're not submitting their SAT or ACT score, I think they will continue implementing this even without COVID affecting test dates.
And you've interviewed some of our former admissions officers about what they focus on now that they're not looking at test scores. Do you just want to highlight some of those factors?
Yeah, absolutely. So SAT essentially, looks at how you perform academically in test taking settings in subjects such as critical reading and mathematics, right? So in lieu of that, they will be looking at your AP scores, if you've taken any college level classes, how you've performed in those, your GPA, of course, the rigor of your school course load, any academic focused extracurriculars, as well as what your teachers have said in the letters of recommendation. Essentially, they're trying to gauge if you will thrive in their, tough academics, college level settings. And if your application can prove that you are able to do that without an SAT score, I think you are in for a good luck in that admissions process.
On the other hand, some schools have actually dropped test optional policies. The most notable example is MIT. Do you want to talk about what do you think motivated this change, and then what sort of schools are following MIT's example, or they might follow MIT's example in the future?
Yeah. I mean, MIT has the same case as the UCs that, they're so in demand that they want to find ways to eliminate some students. So I would say that MIT is still, obviously, because it is the Institute of Technology, so scientifically inclined. They just need to know that students can handle the heavy levels of math and engineering that the school will have to have them deal with. So in order to do that, they would still need to see their math scores, or they would still need to see that they can handle heavy levels of reading and writing. And so I would say that's why MIT has decided to bring back test regulations.
And another change is that the Common App has updated their personal descriptors so that students can describe themselves in a way that better fits with their identity, especially as it relates to gender presentation. How would you say, just in general, students should explore and express their identity in their applications, especially if they come from an identity that is maybe more marginalized?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say share whatever you are comfortable with. You don't have to out yourself if you're not ready, if your family's not aware of it. Don't do anything that puts you in a position of discomfort or danger. Schools just want to be able to support different gender identities and sexualities. So if you feel okay doing so, do it. Of course, like I was saying, you don't have to do anything if you don't fall in this community. Don't lie and say you are part of this LGBTQ community. If you are not, that's just a big red flag. Like, these diversity points are not worth it. It would just make you look very bad if it comes out later that you were lying in your application.
It's interesting that you mentioned how the wildfires might affect California universities, the UCs, like the number of students they let in. I remember wildfire season kind of coincides with finals. So I remember one year UCLA having to cancel their finals because the wildfires were really bad just in Bel Air and the hills above the campus, like ash raining down on the students. So one topic that's really interesting to me is how climate change and areas that are more susceptible to the effects of climate change might affect these universities. I mean, you have somewhere like Tulane that's constantly getting hit by hurricanes, somewhere like College of Charleston. As we're recording this, Hurricane Ian just hit Florida. Do you have any thoughts on that, about how colleges might pivot if they're in a location that's very susceptible to these weather events?
Yeah, I think depending on how they fared when they went online for the pandemic, colleges might switch to being more remote or offering a greater number of remote classes for students who might not feel comfortable making it to these areas. Another thing that did occur to me is that, students themselves are very passionate about the climate and about taking action. And so I think we could see some activism from students themselves and trying to help their local college communities, as well as trying to help colleges, they can act as student liaisons to support the student body in advocating for themselves. I can't necessarily predict what will happen, but I can see schools making some changes, because I can already see, even at the University of New Haven where I teach, they have a bunch of classes that are either remote or asynchronous, because everyone's just on a different schedule, or people or teachers might not be able to come and teach in the same way. So I think we can see online adaptations a lot more in the future.
Right, as you said, politics and social issues are very important to Gen Z, this generation. I think it'll also be interesting to see over the next years how local and state politics affect the school students apply to. And I then know a lot of students, especially female students or students born female, have expressed, concerns about applying to colleges or applying to colleges in certain states due to the Roe v. Wade being overturned. Right. So that'll just be another interesting thing to see probably over the next 5 to 10 years. My next question, a little personal. Columbia. So it's okay. It's okay to have a scandal. I came from USC. We have a lot of scandals. It's all right. Columbia was number 2 on the US News and World Report, and they rose to number 18 because a math professor at Columbia came out and said, I think Columbia kind of made up some of these numbers. Right. So overall, this is kind of undermine the legitimacy of these rankings, because the essential question is how can a university change positions that quickly? Do these rankings really mean any? So what would you say about that question of legitimacy? And as well, do you think this will affect Columbia's prestige, especially students? Do you think this will affect their decision to apply there, to choose them as their ED choice?
Yeah, totally. Okay, let me start with the prestige question first. I don't think it's likely to affect anything much in terms of whether Columbia can still expect a high number of applications. I think it is still extremely prestigious. It has that history, it has that alumni list, and it is, of course, still part of the Ivy League. And we know everyone loves that Ivy League brand name, though, debatable why. If anything, I feel like more students might apply to it thinking it might be less competitive because it's number 18. Sometimes students take these things so at face value that they think Columbia is no longer number 2, they must become magically more or less selective, which is not true. Columbia actually started withholding their acceptance rate, and I think one of the reasons college do that, Princeton and Stanford do that too, is because they don't want students to kind of get stressed out and stop applying to their school because they're too selective. So I don't think we'll see any inflections in, that's not the right word. I don't think we'll see any difference in the change in terms of how many students apply there. I think we'll still continue to see Columbia be very competitive. And in terms of legitimacy of the rankings, I think a true mix, because, it turns out that the US News were basing off their rankings of incorrect data and just taking into value whatever Columbia was saying. And so somewhat, yes, but I don't know that people will care in the short run. I think at the same time, safety schools mean nothing anymore, right? So we have schools ranked 50 or whatever, extremely, extremely selective now. Schools that are comparatively lower than the Ivy, such as BU and Northeastern, have similar, if not lower, acceptances as top 20 schools. So truly just schools have stopped caring about their ranking. They have received more applications. They're becoming more selective. All this is doing is just putting numbers that are kind of arbitrary next to colleges, because everything is just so selective right now. But I think parents, especially that we see at InGenius, very much care about rankings. So I don't think that will change immediately. But in reality, I think the landscape is changing very much, and not in a way that makes top schools look very positive.
Returning to the Supreme Court case with UNC Chapel Hill and Harvard, our Chief Education Officer was just at the National Association for College Counseling Conference, and this was a topic of one of the panels. I think her summary was that regardless of how the decision pans out, and I don't think we can expect a verdict until next year, but regardless how the decision pans out, that colleges are affirming their commitment to diversity
Right.
Do you have anything else to add about this case, how it might change admissions in the short
Yeah.
term, long term?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Well, like you said, in October, it's going to start. The High Court is actually due on Halloween to start hearing oral arguments. So I like you said, we probably won't start hearing anything until like at least early next year, but it would probably take a while. I think what I've seen in the news is that legal experts foresee that given the Supreme Court's, conservative majority, it will almost certainly end race conscious admissions. In doing so, they would be siding with the groups that are suing Harvard and UNC over their enrollment policies. And so I think, like we were saying, that essays are going to be more important or geared towards trying to figure out students who need more help. I think race is often correlated to class, which might see first generation students struggling to find a place in colleges. But when schools such as, Princeton and Harvard and Columbia talk about their enrollment and the students that they've accepted, they're very proud in mentioning the diversity in the classes and how many first generation students are admitted and things like that. So I think they will continue even if the court doesn't allow them to find ways to take this on. Yeah,
that might be like another kind of like offhand way that they approach this issue in the future, is looking at labels like, are you a first generation college student? Although, of course, there is like a lack of clarity in those labels. I read a specific article about like a student at UPenn, and she had like come from like a very privileged family, but it was like an abusive family. So she ended up in foster care, and she checked that she was first gen because she met like the first gen student society's definition, but then she didn't meet UPenn's definition. And so they were like, she was like, I think she was like a fellow at Oxford or something. She was like very successful, but then UPenn was like taking back her degree. And there was just all these issues because they hadn't clearly defined what these terms mean.
Right. Often they will look at what students have answered for that question about their parents' highest level of education, but obviously in a case like that, that's hard to determine if the student doesn't know who their parents are or where their parents went to school.
And are there any other admissions trends that you want to highlight that we might see as a result of these changes we've discussed today?
I think we can expect the number of college applications to continue to increase, just like it has for the past few cycles. A lot more students will apply without an SAT or ACT score, from what I can tell. My students are definitely applying test optional. And as a result, I think AP exams and essays will play a more significant role in terms of admissions decision.
And are there any other changes that you expect in the future, or changes that you would like to see in the future in the world of college admissions?
Totally. I mean, I think in terms of what we expect to see, we are expecting very high competition. As you know, and as we've heard on a previous episode of the podcast, InGenius Prep students had so much greater success in the early round than the regular round, twice as likely to get into Brown. 90% of UChicago's class was admitted from the ED 1 and 2 round. So things like that will continue. I think colleges are very invested in knowing who will accept the position once they get in. And again, because this kind of thing contributes to the US News ranking, I'm sure everyone's more vigilant now about this kind of stuff. So I think early decision will continue to have a high importance. Changes I'd like to see, I would like to see more video portfolios. So Chicago and Brown, instead of interviewing their students, allow them to upload, I think, a 1-minute video where they talk about themselves. And it's just like a way to highlight students who might not be as strong in writing, or, just might be strong in writing anyway, but very charismatic as a person, or give them a chance to explore a side of them that's more creative, or show their creativity in a different way. So I want schools to incorporate this more. And then I think I would like to see schools going test blind or test optional, in terms of making sure the optional is really optional, because some schools say it's optional, but then they end up taking more students who are submitting their scores. So I would like to see test blind become more of a thing. Yeah, I just want students to feel supported. I know everyone is really anxious and it's so hard to predict what works anymore. So I just want things that give students more chance to have fun with these applications.
Yeah, I agree. I'd like to see test blind really being solidified permanently, and then also kind of like deprioritization of rankings. I think rankings can be helpful if they're like major specific rankings, or they're rankings based on like like individual factors like location, graduation rate, but I just think like the overall rankings there's too many complicated factors for them to really tell you like what's the #1 college in America, and then students are just, they're ending up at the wrong schools because of prestige, they're getting themselves in a lot of debt because of a brand name. We'd just like to move away from that eventually.
Yeah.
Do you have any other words of wisdom to share? I know you and your students are really like grinding right now in the season, so I think this episode will come out like mid to late October. So for students who are about to submit their early applications, any words of advice?
Yeah, sure. It is a tough time. I don't personally envy students who are applying this year, but don't freak out. Take it one step at a time. It'll be okay. Take a deep breath. Make sure you're still doing some fun things and not just grinding away at your applications in senior year. Take the time to, watch a movie, hang out with your friends. And like Ellen was saying, be intentional about your school list. Don't go off just brand names and rankings and where your friends are going. Take the time to research and ask yourself if you'd really be happy at a school. You might have the stats and you could end up rejected from a top school because it's not the one for you, like they can tell. So make sure they can really help you grow and reach your goals, and that you can speak about how you can contribute to their campus in ways that are meaningful to both you and the college. So make that decision very intentionally, and chances are you will get into, at least more than one of your top schools.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Poto. I'm sure our listeners appreciate your insight into changes for the 2022 to 23 college application cycle. For more information, check out our blog linked in the episode description. If you have any questions or would like to request a topic for a future episode, go ahead and give us a follow and send us a message on social media with the hashtag Inside Admissions. That's all for now. Thank you for listening, and I hope you'll join me next time as we continue our journey inside the admissions office.